Well, good morning, everyone. It's very, very good to see you all. Great to be with you. I want to thank Tori for her help this morning. Thank you for sharing those wonderful words from Robbie Walsh. That meditation of Robbie's, and you hear a lot of them here on Sunday morning because Robbie's my guy, and he's my spiritual guy. And I think that particular one, More Than We Deserve, it is my absolute favorite UU meditation, and it is, in my view, the best discussion of grace that has ever been written by a Unitarian Universalist. And I would add, or anyone for that matter. Of course, I'm biased because Robbie's my spiritual teacher and mentor, and I've been very blessed by his presence and his words. And thank you all for singing Amazing Grace this morning. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Amazing Grace is the most beloved and popular hymn in the history of American Christianity. I know every time I listen to it, I get caught up in the beauty of the music and in the lyrics that assure me that no matter how broken my life has become, and not being a Calvinist, I generally prefer broken rather than wretch or wretched. But no matter how broken we have become, there is something good, timeless in this world that journeys with us through dangers, that gives us courage and resilience when we are afraid, that helps us find our way home when we are lost. I don't know, I imagine some of you are familiar with the story of the writing of Amazing Grace. It's an 18th century piece. It originally was a poem written by a clergyman and poet named John Newton. What's really significant about Newton, or interesting, is that earlier in his life, he had played a key role in the international slave trade, captaining ships that were forcibly carrying newly enslaved people from the west coast of Africa to the Americas. A storm at sea that nearly capsized his ship led Newton to cry out for God's mercy and to convert to Christianity. Unfortunately, it still took him several more years working in the slave trade before he finally decided that enslaving human beings was in conflict with his newly found faith. Newton eventually left the slave trade and became an influential clergyman and spiritual writer. And to his credit, he did dedicate much of the rest of his life to abolishing the international slave trade and became a spiritual mentor for the leader of that movement, at least in the British Parliament, William Wilberforce. Now, while John Newton's contributions to abolishing the slave trade and to deepening what one might call Christian piety or spirituality are undeniable, Amazing Grace will always be his lasting legacy. While it certainly gained popularity in his home country, it was here in the United States, and especially among Christian evangelicals and so on in the 19th century, that led Amazing Grace to become such a powerful hymn. And that popularity and influence persists right up to today. While Amazing Grace is sometimes sung in times of joy and celebration, it is during moments of despair and loss that it seems to especially resonate and touch the soul. I'm sure many of you remember watching when former President Obama sang Amazing Grace at the end of his eulogy for the victims of the horrific mass shooting at the Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. There's a picture of President Obama singing that song. In that remarkable moment, I think the then president reminded us to look for that reservoir of goodness that is beyond and somehow of another kind, which he called grace. And then he began to sing the hymn which has helped so many find their way back to healing and hope. I want to spend my time this morning exploring with you a little bit, what does grace mean? And especially, what does grace mean in this religion, Unitarian Universalism? We don't use the word grace as often as maybe we should, and it doesn't appear in our 7 principles. And although Amazing Grace is in our hymnal, it isn't sung very often in our services. And when it is, it's most frequently sung during memorial services. I'm not totally sure why grace doesn't appear in many of our sermons or services, but I think the beginning of an answer can be found in the simple fact that concepts like grace are often associated with one religious tradition, Christianity, and with one particular theological idea or assumption, namely belief in a transcendent God who dwells above and beyond. So let's just begin at the beginning here. The dictionary defines grace as unmerited divine assistance. Another definition states that grace is the love and mercy given to us by God because God desires us to have it, not because of anything we have done to earn it. Now, leaving aside the question of where grace comes from, it seems clear that grace most assuredly is a gift that we receive through no actions of our own. We don't earn or have to pay for or even necessarily deserve grace. Grace is indeed a gift that we receive without doing anything to earn it. A gift that sees us somehow through darkness and despair. And if we look at the lyrics from Amazing Grace, we see, I think, much of this same understanding. Grace is given to us in spite of our brokenness, and grace leads us safely home through our fear. And although God is not mentioned until the final verse, it is God's praise that is credited as being the source of grace. Now, as I said before, I think, from my perspective, that any discussion of what does grace mean, what's it about, and especially in this tradition, Unitarian Universalism, begins with Robbie's wonderful meditation. Now, he doesn't actually use the word grace, but I think what he's talking about is entirely about grace. Think for a moment about his experience listening to Bach's Second Brandenburg. As he listens to that amazing music, he can't help but feel that he has been given an incredible gift, a gift that so far exceeds anything he's ever done or deserved or given in his life. And realistically, what can one ever do to earn or deserve something as beautiful as Bach, as breathtaking as the Grand Canyon, or as magnificent as the birth of a child or a grandchild? As Robbie says, he hasn't been kind or just or loving enough to have earned something like Bach, but it was given to him anyway. And for that amazing gift, he feels so very grateful and so very blessed. I think that's what it means to experience grace. Now, maybe Bach isn't your cup of tea. That's okay. I'm guessing everyone in this room has experienced moments like that. Maybe you've been moved to joy or tears by a beautiful poem or a piece of music. Maybe by the scent of a flower or the beauty of a garden. By a walk in the woods or the smile on a child's face. Those moments of grace often come when we encounter something vast and awe-inspiring. or something that touches our hearts so deeply that we are indeed swept away. And as Robbie reminds us, we live in a universe that is overflowing with grace. Those undeserved gifts and blessings are everywhere and in every moment, and are actually built into the very nature of existence. As he says so well, life itself is a gift we haven't earned and for which we cannot pay. There's no necessity that there be a universe, no inevitability about a world moving toward life and self-consciousness. There might have been nothing at all. So part of my answer to the meaning of grace in Unitarian Universalism is simply this. We Unitarian Universalists most assuredly experience grace. We are touched by the beauty of those unearned gifts and blessings because we experience them in our own lives. And I think we also believe in a universe that is filled with grace. We believe that grace abounds, that grace is everywhere, and that grace is built into the beauty, the wonder, and the mysteries of life. And I use that word mystery very, very deliberately, because I think it points to something important about the way Unitarian Universalism understands the roots or sources of grace. In the definitions we usually encounter, and you heard earlier, grace is seen as a gift from God, and in some cases, even as evidence of God's approval. In theological terms, grace can be a sign of our justification or sanctification in the eyes of God. In Unitarian Universalism, I think I'm on fairly firm ground here in saying that the ultimate source of grace is indeed a mystery. Grace may indeed be a gift from a transcendent God who resides above and beyond, or perhaps within us. We really don't know. You know, maybe precisely where grace comes from really isn't the most important question. What I think is most important is that those awe-inspiring and life-enriching gifts and blessings, they're real. They bring beauty and meaning and hope to our lives. Listen to how Anne Lamott, great spiritual writer, many of you know Anne Lamott, I assume. Listen to what she says. She says, "I do not at all understand the mystery of grace, only that it meets us where we are, but doesn't leave us where it found us." Grace doesn't leave us where it found us. But if we can't say with certainty what the ultimate source of grace is, we do know that those undeserved gifts and blessings, they call us to live with gratitude and generosity, with kindness and love. Listen again to what Robbie said. "Since we have not earned Bach or crocuses or lovers, the best we can do is to express our gratitude for the undeserved gifts and to do our share of the work of creation." You know, in many of the sermons I heard Robbie preach, he frequently outlined a kind of transactional model of life and religion that was rooted in the reality of grace. Life, he would say, is a marvelous gift that we have all been given. There might have been nothing at all. It is a gift whose sources and meaning will always, at some level, remain a mystery. But life is most assuredly a gift, and that gift places a responsibility on each of us, a responsibility to be generous, to give back, to do justice, and to tend the gardens of creation. That's our purpose. That's our calling. That's our responsibility. And that is the final part of my answer to the question of how Unitarian Universalists understand grace. Grace isn't simply a gift that we receive. Grace is also a gift that we give and a blessing that we share with others through acts of love and generosity, kindness and sympathy. We act as the agents and, yes, the instruments of grace. We are the receivers of grace, and we are the givers of grace. I want to just leave you this morning with a brief story, and I think is one of my favorite stories about one of those moments of grace. And this story also comes from Anne Lamott in her book, Traveling Mercies. The story takes place on a Sunday morning at her somewhat non-traditional, somewhat liberal Presbyterian congregation, but a congregation that really drew people of many different faiths in San Francisco. And this particular story takes place during the time when the HIV/AIDS epidemic was ravaging the gay community and tragically taking so many lives. Sitting alone in the front pew that morning was a man named Ken, who was sadly and tragically dying from HIV/AIDS. Ken had begun attending the church after his longtime partner, Brandon, had died of the virus. Ken was terribly weak, and his body was so thin and even emaciated. But when he smiled, his face, which often looked contorted and pained, became radiant. The church, Ken said, had helped fill the hole left in his life when Brandon had died. Now, sitting not too far from Ken that particular morning was a woman named Renola. Renola was older and had been singing in the church choir for a number of years. Before moving to California, she had grown up a Southern Baptist, and her faith was traditional, pretty biblical, and devout. Ever since Ken had been attending the church, Renola had been pretty standoffish toward him because for much of her life, she had been taught that Ken's way of life was an abomination. Now, during the first hymn, Ken could not stand up with the rest of the congregation, so he sang with joy as he sat in his pew, the hymnal unfolded on his lap. When it came time for the second hymn, the whole congregation had risen, and once again, only Ken remained seated, holding his hymnal in his lap. Renola watched Ken somewhat skeptically for a moment, and then Anne Lamott says her face began to melt and contort. And she went to Ken's side and bent down to lift him up. Lifting up, as Anne Lamott says, this white rag doll that she had been avoiding. Renola held Ken next to her, draped over and against her like a child while they sang. And Anne Lamott concludes the story by simply saying, "The sight of Ken and Renola pierced me." And friends, I don't think it comes as a surprise that I see and Anne Lamott sees that moment when Ken and Renola sang together. That was most certainly a moment of grace. Both were touched by grace, a grace that stirred something kind and generous in Renola's heart and that led her to share that kindness with Ken. In that moment, both experienced a spirit of love and healing whose origins we may never understand, but whose power and presence most assuredly blesses our lives. Let me just conclude by saying, as a UU, and I'm a good, skeptical, sometimes doubting, uncertain UU as much as the rest of you, I really believe that grace is real, that grace blesses our lives, and that each and every one of us are both receivers and givers of grace. I don't know if grace is a gift from God or if it is instead a result of the love and goodness that dwells in the human heart. Maybe it's both. But I do know that grace doesn't depend on who you are, where you come from, what you believe, or who you love. Grace isn't reserved for the few or the saved. Grace is a gift that is given to and shared with everyone. Friends, I don't have to tell you that we live in a world that is so hurting and broken and that can too often, yes, feel pretty wretched. But in the midst of that brokenness, let love and compassion, kindness and friendship do your best to let them be your guides. And may you let grace, beautiful and bountiful grace, always lead you home. Amen. Thank you so much for listening, and blessed be.